conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. Welcome back to Africa for Dummies. I'm your host, Zenge. Today, we journey back across the rivers and the forests, the deserts and the coasts, to the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, where 13 European powers and the United States sat around the table in Berlin, slicing up an entire continent like a cake, with barely a thought for the people living there. This was the so-called civilizing mission, or as Rudyard Kipling, a famous poet, called it, the white man's burden, a claim that Europe had the moral duty to bring light, order, and progress to Africa. But what was left in this wake of civilization? Broken systems, stolen resources, cartoonish distorted borders, and colonial legacies that still shape African societies today. In this episode, we'll unpack the different forms of colonialism, from settler colonialism in Southern Africa, to indirect rule in West Africa, to company rule in the Congo Free State, and how these systems cast long shadows over the present. Joining me is Professor Stephen Chan, a renowned scholar on African politics and international relations from the University of SOAS, who will help us peel back the layers of history and understand how these colonial footprints still mark African economies, institutions, and identities. So settle in. Let's journey into the heart of Africa's colonial past and confront the forces that continue to shape its future.
I am an African.
Hello guys, and welcome back to another episode of Africa for Dummies. And this time we're going to be doing a few series actually, and we're joined by an incredible guest, a bit of a legend actually, at least so far as foreign policy nerds go, and African politics. It's Professor Stephen Chan from the University of SOAS. That's based in London, and he's done loads and loads of works. It's pretty hard to sort of fully comprehend his achievements and various titles, and he's also in, I think, jiu-jitsu as well, or karate. So yeah, it's good. Yeah, quite a wide range of expertise. But this time we'll be talking to him about African politics. So I'll just like to welcome onto our show for the first time, Professor Stephen Chan.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. Very happy to see you all, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Sure. Yeah. So as usual, my name is Zenge. I'm your host. Unfortunately, Nathan is super occupied with a lot of other things today, so it's just going to be me. But we're going to dive deep into the differences in colonization and just generally the original scramble for Africa. So 140 years ago, the scramble of Africa began. So in 1884 to 1885, there was the Berlin Conference. So a number of European powers gathered and determined the future of Africa. So we just want to begin by understanding what exactly was this conference about, and why was it necessary? Why was it necessary to have this conference in the first place?
Okay, we've got to bear in mind it was not just a single conference. There were Berlin conferences, plural. One in 1878, for instance. The European powers wanted to find out how to go ahead after the wars involving Turkey. So what you had was the use of Berlin as a major place for coming to agreements. And what the European powers wanted to do in 1884-85, literally Christmas 84 to New Year 85, was to find a way forward over Africa that did not involve them going to war. In other words, Europe had had so many years of war. The last thing it wanted was yet another war over a place which was still, to a certain extent, an unknown quantity.
Yeah.
What was a known quantity was that the Congo was very rich. So it began as a conference centered on the Congo, but then spread out into the wider continent. What are we going to do about this wider continent? Not that much was known about the rest of Africa. And so what they proceeded by way of decision-making was, look, you've got a presence here, you've got missionaries here, You've got traders here. We've got traders here. We've got missionaries here. We've already got minor spheres of influence. So a lot of the map of Africa was basically divided up according to spheres of influence. And where they couldn't agree, they simply drew a straight line, which is why the map of Africa has got so many straight lines. Now, the political cartoonists of the day were following this. And so you literally had political cartoons in the European newspapers of European leaders dividing up Africa as if it were a Christmas pudding. That's what they were doing, basically, having Christmas dinner, deciding the fate of an entire continent. But basically, they decided to do this without going to war. Everyone wanted to have their share. Not everyone got their share. The Italians were left out of the picture, for instance. But basically, most of the European powers got a piece of Africa.
Yeah, so I think if we can continue, I think that's a very good sort of background context picture of it, and it's quite ironic that they had to stop themselves from going to war over a continent that wasn't really theirs. And also another thing that you mentioned was the boundaries, the borders of Africa. It's quite cartoonish. Like, I mean, being from Zambia, I think we have very good examples of how literally straight lines and the people on those straight lines don't really care much about those borders. I went to sort of where my mom comes from, her native village, and you could literally see Malawi. Like, you could just literally point at a tree and say, "That's Malawi," and the trees don't look any different. The people don't speak any different language. It's exactly the same. And on more serious note, you have a lot of sort of issues that have to this day still emanate from those boundaries. And just to get a picture of who was at the Berlin conference, of course, many people say, there's that famous map that they have that's like pink for Britain, and there's like I forgot what color it was for France, but there were quite a number of colonial powers there. I think Russia was also there as well. Almost all of the major European powers, and even the United States as well.
Yeah, but not all of them got pieces of Africa. The major colonial powers that emerged from Berlin were, in fact, Britain, as you say, France, Portugal, Belgium. We got a very great deal, particularly when it came to the Congo. The Germans, East Africa, what we now call Namibia. The Russians, nothing. The Americans, nothing. They weren't interested in being colonial powers. But the European powers certainly were. Basically, they've brought themselves to a standstill in Europe. So they've thought that the way of going forward in the world on a competitive basis was controlling other parts of the world.
Yeah.
They couldn't control all of Europe, but they could control other parts of the world. And so the scramble for Africa was on, literally starting 1884, 85, over Christmas and New Year celebrations. And as I said, the political cartoonists just had a field day with Africa being carved up like a Christmas pudding.
Yeah. And we, when I was growing up, at least historically, they were either the three Gs and the three Cs, so in terms of the reasons for colonization. And the three Gs stood for, I think, God, glory, and gold. And then the three C's stood for Christianity, commerce, and civilization. To what extent, could you just like sort of expand on that? To what extent are these true? And what really were the main reasons for wanting to dominate other parts? Was it trade? Was it simply, Rudyard Kipling's white man's burden that we need to civilize the African people and blah, 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 and all of those things? What was the real reason? Yeah.
Well, there's no real reason. It was a conglomeration of different reasons, many of which were justifications afterwards. For instance, in terms of God and Christianity, don't forget the Islamic powers had been in Africa beforehand. So you had a very, very strange, as it were, realization
Yeah.
What you had in Africa were different belief systems, not just those that were indigenous to the continent, but a very great deal of Islam as well, and a very great deal of difference in terms of styles of rulership and African government.
Yeah.
Some kingship states, for instance, others more of a flat line, consultative way of doing things. So they didn't come up with a common template as to how to handle these things. They didn't really know, except for the Congo, just how rich different parts of the continent were.
Yeah.
They knew that there were resources in Ghana, for instance, because of cocoa, because of gold, in fact. But that's not because of the Europeans discovering that. That's because the Ashanti Kingdom in Ghana was already trading on the London stock market. They were basically going ahead themselves with their own form of indigenous capitalism integrating with global capitalism. And so they saw that there was a market there they could take over. But for most other countries, they didn't know about these things. They only discovered most of the minerals in Africa, apart from the Congo, afterwards. So a lot of this is justification after the fact. Now, missionaries, of course, God
Missionaries,
had a lot to do with it in terms of justifying to parliaments and to governments why they were doing this. Because don't forget, what you had in Europe was already a history of colonialism, not all of which had gone well.
Within Europe?
Well, not just within Europe, but in other parts of the world. For instance, what you had in the War of Independence in the Americas, United States of America, basically the European powers lost out on that as America in 1776 declared itself independent.
Right.
What you had similarly with Spain and Portugal in South America, with Simon Bolivar, called the Liberator, gaining independence for all of these countries in South America. A lot of the colonial experience had for the European powers gone sour. And of course, what you had was a concentration not so much on Africa, but a concentration on India, and a very great deal of anxiety as to how to deal with China. We can't control China, but can we subjugate them?
So even then, China was still a bit of a threat.
Not a threat at all. It was a decadent society. They hadn't moved with the times. The Japanese had, Chinese hadn't. But it was too big to control. So basically, can we subjugate them so they'll do what we want them to do without our having to get in there and govern them ourselves? And so when they came to Africa, this was just another stage of the whole colonial enterprise. As I said, not all of the colonial enterprise had gone well. Now, to a certain extent, it had gone well in India for the British. But there they used a certain model of government. In other words, when we talk about divide and rule, it was applied in India first. They made deals with the local princes, the local rajas, and basically, you guys cooperate with us, we let you stay in power, but basically you're in power on your behalf, but also on our behalf. And so using as a kingship states as a form of colonial rule, they were able to take that to a certain extent to Africa, but not to all parts of it. So that's why you have different forms of colonial government in Africa. In countries which had a far more flat-line consultative way of dealing with things, like Zambia, for instance, there's 72 different groups of people, all with their own way of dealing with things. And very few of them actually kingship states. I mean, the Lozi people, the Tonga people are kingship states, for instance. The Bemba people are kingship states. But people who speak Chinyanja are not kingship states. So you have that same difference in Zimbabwe. The Shona are not as much of a kingship state as the Ndebele. So you have different styles that the British and the French had to get used to. Now, insofar as the British found some kingship states, like Uganda, like Nigeria,
Uganda Kingdom,
that's right, they applied the Indian model, divide and rule, get the local kings and princes to work on your behalf, give them titles, sir this, sir that, handed them out. Now, the French got more of that than the British. They had access after Berlin to huge, not just kingship states, but to empire states, like the great Mali Empire, one of the great situations of civilization, as the Europeans like to call it, but genuinely, as it were, developed.
Timbuktu.
Yeah, Timbuktu, one of the great universities and libraries of the world. It ranked with Alexandria, it ranked with Ephesus, the legendary places of learning. That was very, very much associated with Mali, site of great poetry, great learning, great Quranic, Islamic learning, and cities. All of these things we normally associate with the so-called civilization. The French got more of that than the British, for instance. Yeah. So the French model tends to be quite different to the British model. What happened was that since there were fewer kingship states outside of Nigeria, a bit of Ghana, Uganda, the British basically developed, as it were, this style of settler colonialism. We go and then we rule them and we own the land. Okay. It's caused lots of problems, of course.
Yeah.
Huge problems to this very, very day. And they did it also on a corporate model. So when you talk about Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, spreading up to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and of course what was Northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, as well as Malawi. This was corporate colonialism on behalf of the crown.
That was the British South African Company, yeah?
That's right. They were in there for the money. Yeah. And they were allowed to do that because they were able to basically provide revenue to the empire. They paid revenues into the British government, and so they were allowed to basically develop as they wished. And the whole idea of having all of these territories, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, that's a pretty big chunk of Southern Africa. And Rhodes had this ambition, this dream, of what he called the Cape to Cairo route, the road Cape to Cairo, which is why the main road in Lusaka to this day is still called Cairo Road.
Yeah,
legacy. Part of this great North Road. It's all meant to join up finally in Cairo, and then join up the continent. They never did that. The Chinese are doing it now, but the British failed in completing the Cairo Road. And that would have given them, as it were, control of a continent, not just on military terms, but in economic terms, because everything would be joined up. They also recognized that if you were going to govern Africa, you had to have communications. Thus, the road was very, very important. Mm-hmm. That's why colonialism became very fragmented. They couldn't join it up.
Yeah.
And so you have all these individual countries that never got together. They would have gotten together in a different way to what they were before colonialism. But even that would have been problematic, because in what way would they have gotten together if they had wanted to be like before? Because basically, roughly speaking, you've got 2,000 different ethnicities in Africa, 2,000 languages, not dialects, languages. Now, obviously, there are cognate words that go backwards and forwards between languages, just like there are between English and French and Spanish, for instance. You know a little bit of one of those languages, you could read the football pages in the other countries. We all know that Paris Saint-Germain won the European Cup.
Big news now.
You could read that in the French newspapers, even if you're not a great French speaker. But that doesn't mean that the languages are the same. There are cognate words that go backwards and forwards. But 2,000 different languages in Africa, which means 2,000 different ways of thinking. Because the way you speak determines to a huge extent the way that you are able to perceive the world. That's why Ngugi wrote Decolonizing the Mind. For God's sake, we start using our own language, because otherwise we're thinking like a white man. If we use our own language, at least we can start thinking like ourselves. We could be more
I think that was in the book Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
That was absolutely his book, this most famous
Kenyan literature icon.
That's right. And of course, he just recently died.
Yes.
He wrote great novels, as well as great books of essays, as well as Decolonizing the Mind, which basically established the entire movement towards decolonization, not just as a political act, but as an act of authenticity. Can we be our own people? Can we have our own minds? And so that's become a major, major movement that spread out from Africa, from Ngugi. In other words, what you've got is after colonialism, the tables are turning slightly. And decolonization is the buzzword right now, and picked up by the Chinese, for instance, or
Yeah.
by other people. They all want to be free of being dominated by Western influences, not do away with them. The world is global. We've got to live with each other, but basically to be able to state our own position in the world on our own terms, with some basic reference to our own cultures and our own histories. So Africa is doing that now. So what you've got, 1884-85, the Berlin Conference, today 2025, is actually a huge movement in history, which has happened with Africa at the center.
Mm.
So whatever
Yeah.
the colonial powers tried, it didn't completely work. It worked for a short time, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah, I think many people sort of underestimate the length of formal colonization from the 1880s up to the 1960s. That's not even 100 years, and the level of and the depth of colonization of Africa has been so deep. Somehow, for even though the formal one was very short, though one could say, if we include slavery and all of the other aspects, stretches for maybe half a century. But I think when I interact with people from different parts of the continent, you do see legacies of this. And I'm very curious as to how these countries were colonized. And as we sort of began to start talking about decolonizing the mind, so how exactly was the mind colonized? When we talk about sort of the British indirect rule, where they pick a local chief. And that's also another aspect of agency that I argue, although it's not necessarily the most positive agency, but these chiefs sometimes would inflate their territorial claim and ask the British to defend them and defeat their enemies in exchange for mining concessions and etc. And so that was the indirect rule. But then there was also other forms of sort of this three-tier rule where you have the white settlers on top, the Asian sort of, sometimes if mixed race was included, then maybe, yeah, and then they have the blacks on the bottom. And you also had different laws as well, like native lands and so on. But then I noticed there was forms of assimilation in the French one, sort of like you can graduate into becoming a French citizen. And then the Portuguese, it's like they never ever accepted that there will ever be a time when black people will rule their country. So if you can just maybe spread a bit of light on those differences.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Portuguese and the French models were similar to a certain extent, but you're right. The Portuguese never wanted to decolonize. They wanted to, quote unquote, develop their colonies so that they would become departments or provinces of metropolitan Portugal. But they, like the French, did select key intellectual figures to come to Lisbon in particular to study for university degrees. Now, in fact, there had been this process of Portuguese assimilation for a huge number of years, well before colonialism. Basically, it was possible for a black man, a very, very rare occasion, but even 300 years ago, to become a Portuguese knight, to become a nobleman. Didn't happen very, very often, but if you showed that you could assimilate and become, quote unquote, civilized, the Portuguese were prepared to do that. And they wanted to build a ruling class. Of course, this backfired because what you had were people who came over to study, people like Cabral, who became leaders of liberation. And not only that, but inspired his student mates at university to launch a revolution of their own in the mid-70s, the Carnation Revolution, the Revolution of the Captains. Those were the classmates.
That was the revolution that ended the Salazar leadership.
Absolutely.
of
and the very first thing the young soldiers did, all captains, it's a very junior rank, was say, okay, next year we're going to decolonize. We're going to let all the colonies become independent. Wasn't much time to do it well, but basically they were influenced by Cabral. Now, Cabral and others, Augustino Neto, the leader of
First president of Angola, yeah.
That's right. They all had come over to become educated to a high level. I mean, Cabral was a very good agronomist, for instance.
Yeah.
Neto was a medical doctor. And of course, you have that throughout the colonies. I mean, Frantz Fanon, the famous as a philosopher of liberation, came from Martinique, the Caribbean. but he became a doctor and a psychiatrist at a very, very high level. So the French and the Portuguese were prepared to do that. Now, the French in a slightly different way to the Portuguese. The French system of higher education, I hate to say this because I'm meant to be a British educator, is by far the most elite in the world. So what you had when, for instance, Senghor, who later became the president of independent Senegal, when he came over to study, President Senghor, Leopold Senghor, he came top of the country in what they call the agrégation. This is the toughest exam in the world.
Wow.
He came top of France in the agrégation in Latin and Greek.
So as a black man, he came among the top of everyone, essentially, in Latin and Greek.
In Western civilization, basically.
Goodness.
Those are the classic languages of Western civilization. He could do better than they. And of course, he was a considerable scholar, considerable poet. They made him, as it were, an MP, a French deputy in the French Parliament. He was a junior minister. They made him a member of the French Academy, but always with the aim of one day, should these countries become, as it were, independent or autonomous in some way, we've got a very highly educated elite who can actually interact with us as if they were black Frenchmen. Now, I'm not saying that Senghor was a black Frenchman. He could do things better than a Frenchman, as I said. But basically, what you had was the cultivation of an elite. And what really drove the bargain home was World War II. We keep forgetting this. People like Fanon fought for the French against the Nazis.
Frantz Fanon,
Frantz Fanon, he fought. He was wounded, he was decorated, he was given medals, because basically these people realized that we've got it bad now with the colonizing powers. Black Africans will have it much worse underneath Nazi Germany. They exterminate people, don't they? So basically they were prepared to fight for values associated with liberation, like democracy, freedom of expression, etc., etc., even though they were applied very hypocritically in Europe. All the same, when you've got the devil, the deep black blue sea, whatever, you choose the lesser of the two evils. But what happened was that during World War II, France was overrun. Their army was far, far too old-fashioned. They couldn't stand against the modern, as it were, mobile tank warfare developed by the Germans. When the only French general who made a stand successfully, briefly, General de Gaulle, escaped to England, and he said to Winston Churchill, the leader of the British, "I am the leader of the Free French." And Churchill said, "Of what are you the leader? France has fallen." And de Gaulle just said, "The colonies have stood firm." Now, this is very, very important because the bargain was, we'll let you have independence after this war is over. It was never written down, but that was the agreement with the nationalist leaders who had been educated to a very high level in France. And so that was a spur to decolonization, which most Anglophonic scholars don't think about. And the French in some ways made this kind of bargain so they could get through World War II. And of course,
and that's actually very, very interesting because we interviewed he's now deceased, sadly, a guy in his 90s, a former Rhodesian, Northern Rhodesian soldier from World War II. And he speaks of very high regard of his British captain somehow. But he feels sort of like when you dig deep and ask him the questions about equality, you realize that actually things were not, even on the battlefield, they would eat in different quarters and so on. So it was quite an interesting angle.
Yeah, you couldn't be promoted beyond a certain level.
Yeah, he was a
that's
private.
why when Rhodesia became independent as Zimbabwe in 1980, there was not a single black captain in the Rhodesian forces.
Wow.
They just couldn't find their way to, recognize. And captain is quite a junior rank, but it's a commissioned officer's rank. But the white settler mentality just prevented them from doing that. The French would allow some modest promotion, but not that high. In other words, you're not going to become a general or anything like that.
Yeah.
But basically, assimilation in the Portuguese and the French systems were different to the British. Because you had settler colonies dominating the British way of doing things, all the settlers wanted were people who were educated enough to do what they wanted them to do.
And they do say, I've seen arguments in favor of colonialism saying we brought education, but then it's almost like the education was not necessarily meant for liberation. It was more so meant for, as you mentioned, the levels of success on the hierarchy were limited. So it wasn't necessarily meant for emancipation in a sense.
Yeah, that's right. Now, you got educated enough to be a clerk, to be a teacher or a clerk. That's why when Zambia, your country where I also lived some years, when it became independent, Kaunda only had 96 graduates to help run the country.
96 university graduates.
Big country. That's all. That's why one of the first things Kaunda did was to build UNSA, to build a university.
University of Zambia, yeah.
Yeah, he had to. Yeah, he had to have personnel to run the place. So,
all right. So I think that's... go ahead.
Yeah, when Congo became independent, there were 2 qualified Congolese doctors. Two. You see how big that country is? They're a huge country.
Yeah. A country the size of Western Europe only has 2 black or 2 native doctors. Yeah.
Yep.
And so it's quite extraordinary because the styles, I think the main aspect in all of this was sort of the domination of an external power over the other, although they had very different ways of sort of dealing with it and sort of graduating. And I think the Congo was a very fascinating one, going back to the source of the actual conference, because it was a private entity at one point, right? The King Leopold.
It became, as it were, in the colonial agreement, it was the property of the King of Belgium, Leopold, who, unrestrained by Parliament, and even the Belgian Parliament, were scandalized sorry, how badly Leopold was treating people in Congo. But basically, for a brief time, Congo became the richest country in Europe because of the ransacking, the looting of mineral resources there, all of which belonged to the king, not to the state. Afterwards,
not personal wealth.
Yeah, but basically, Leopold was in it for the money and treated people in a scandalous way. So the Belgian style of colonization is probably one of the worst examples of colonization. And again, divide and rule. You have that in Rwanda and Burundi, purposely dividing the Tutsis and the Hutus, almost making them enemies, favoring one above the other.
And that I remember Mahmoud Mamdani, another scholar from Uganda, almost referred to them as different. They were categorized almost into races rather than just simply ethnic groups. There's sort of
basically, Mamdani is right. I mean, I would probably choose slightly different vocabulary, but the idea was to make one different enough to the other that they would regard each other as enemies, antagonistic to each other.
Yeah.
So the Belgians were very, very good at that. They've got a lot to answer for in both Congo and the Rwanda-Burundi area, where, of course, these ethnic tensions continue to this day. I mean, the whole M23 extreme episode, Rwanda supported Congolese rebels taking over huge chunks of DRC. There's still a remnant of that divide and rule on the part of the Belgians. The Germans, for a time, had parts of East Africa, what we now call Tanzania, didn't do a very good job. Yeah, but they lost Tanzania after World War II. And of course, they did terrible things in Namibia.
The Herero and Nama.
Herero people in particular. And that can be generally classified as genocide. The word genocide is used rather loosely these days, but that was genuinely so.
And huge. So I think we've we've covered quite a lot in terms of the different styles and mannerisms of colonization and why colonization even happened in the first place, especially the one that I think is very heavily talked about, which could be an episode on its own, to be honest, the Free State of Congo, which was a private property with really egregious atrocities. I think it was the beginning of the first sort of human rights campaign. Like, how ruthless do you have to be for people to invent human rights campaigns at that point? And the sort of atrocious pictures of one hand that's been chopped off because they didn't cut enough rubber. So yeah, but I think in all of this, maybe we've sort of missed out the aspects of resilience and resistance that we've saw across Africa. I think we talked about the genocides and the different motivations, but there's many incidents of resistance from African actors. And I think the first episode of this podcast was actually on the new Scramble of Africa. And I think one of the big things that I really was obsessed with, and I still am, is this idea of agency, be it diplomatic agency with Queen Zenge in Angola, but also just militaristic agency. The famous Anglo-Zulu Wars in 1879, the Ashanti Wars in 1824 to 900 against the British, the Maji Maji Rebellion in Tanzania, the Mahdist Revolt in Sudan, obviously where I live now in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the Battle of Adwa, which is I think the most famous one. So can you just let us know what forms of resistance took place and sort of how did this sort of influence future leaders of Africa, and why is that still relevant today?
No, it is very, very relevant because there was resistance, as you say, diplomatic resistance, as you gave the example of Queen Zenge, who ruled over a lot of what is now modern Angola, for instance, using diplomacy with the Vatican. And in fact, the records of what she tried to do are still in the Vatican archives, realizing that you've got to fight fire with fire. These people are coming with such huge organization, which is basically made possible by communicating, reading and writing. Well, we better do that too.
Yeah.
And so she petitioned the Vatican for people to come and teach them how to read and write in Latin, which was the international language of diplomatic communication. So she was very, very wise in terms of seeing a diplomatic avenue. There was warfare, of course. The British suffered a huge defeat at the hands of the Zulu warriors, for instance. But the chief battle of great, as it were, triumph for an African army was, as you said, the Battle of Adwa, 1896, and the very late effort of the Italians to get a piece of the action. Now, what is interesting about this, and about the battle between the Zulu and the British armies, was that modern weapons were used. Okay, the Zulus had modern repeater rifles, not enough of them. British had more. So that probably turned the tide. In other words, just the sheer volume of firepower. But in the Battle of Adwa, the Ethiopians against the Italians matched the Italians in terms of firepower. Repeater rifles.
Ethiopians matched the Italian firepower.
Matched the firepower. Yeah, repeater rifles, cannons, the lot, as well as being able to field their traditional cavalry and spear people, including female warriors. And in fact, the Empress herself led the commandos to sabotage the back lines of the Italians. So everyone was involved in this as a national effort. And it was one of these curious battles because what you had, and you see this in all the paintings that you can buy at street stores in Addis Ababa to this day, both sides have Red Cross tents because, of course...
The Red Cross was there?
Well, no. I mean, the Ethiopian Coptic Church is the first organized Christian church. They beat the Catholics to it by a few years. The oldest liturgy on earth is the Ethiopian Coptic liturgy, which is why in all the paintings of the battle, what you have are the angels of heaven flying with the Ethiopians, and they're black.
Yeah, that's
So
something I noticed a lot in Ethiopia. Many of the depiction of Christianity are black, Afros. Whereas, coming from Zambia, Jesus looks rather European. At best, they make him a bit
yeah,
tanned, but not really.
the Zambian version, Jesus needs a good suntan, but in
Yeah,
Ethiopia,
yeah,
I mean, you go to Somali town, which is still part of the not quite developed fringe of central Addis Ababa. You have all these fantastic street paintings, and you can pick up these paintings. They also claim the Queen of Sheba was
yes.
theirs. And
Sort of the mother of Ethiopia, modern Ethiopia.
that's right, Wagner of Ethiopia. And they have a slightly different version of the story. She didn't go to marvel at the wisdom of Solomon. She went to see whether or not Solomon was as smart as she was. In other words,
Mm.
she was the intellectual force,
Yeah.
going to see whether or not this much, much rumored, legendary intellectual figure was up to scratch. So the Ethiopians have got this claim in their history and their mythology to prowess and battle, to Christianity, and to intellectual accomplishment. And in both the Battle of Adwa and the story of the Queen of Sheba, to a certain form of gender equality, which is not always present in Africa, even to this day.
Yeah.
In other words, the Queen of Sheba is theirs, and she's smarter than any man. The Empress herself at the Battle of Adwa leads the commando troops to sabotage the back lines of the Italian army. And basically, you also have field commanders, spearwomen, swordswomen fighting in the front ranks of the Ethiopian army, as well as, of course, the angels of heaven flying overhead. So,
I
really,
think
I would say the most glorious,
the
the
Empress
most glorious battle of
Taitu.
all was Adwa.
Yeah, I think the Empress Taitu. There's things named after her here as well, and I think it's not discussed about a lot. But Taitu Betul, she was the wife of Menelik II in the 80s and 90s, and I think there's a new gigantic monument that has been built in the center of Addis called the Victory Memorial, and it's shining and gleaming and fountains everywhere. That's like everywhere wherever people take their girlfriends and boyfriends on dates and take photos and so on. And it's a humongous monument to the Adwa Memorial, and there's also a huge depiction of Taitu, the empress herself, pointing at a pool of water. And when it was explained to me, they said that she was actually strategic in blocking a certain water reserve that was sort of replenishing the Italian forces that were trying to take Addis, and that's how she
Yeah.
sort of turned the tide in that war, which I found very, very interesting. When you're outside Addis, all you hear is that, oh yeah, no, they defeated the Italians, but you don't. Uh, Once you come to Ethiopia and see these stories, it's quite insightful. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's probably a very sort of inspiring note to close the episode. I think we've touched on a lot of huge things that obviously is not exhaustive, but I think the main points that have been brought out is obviously the Africa's was not colonized simply because there was no one there. There was various different forms of agreements, obviously exploitative, dominative agreements, but there were all sorts of strange agreements and arrangements. And it was sort of a way to not only economically exploit, but even culturally exploit, especially with the different forms of, like the French with the assimilation and basically saying if using the example of Leopold Senghor, of course, a liberator of Senegal, but at the same time, he was used as an example of a perfect African Frenchman. And I think also we've also looked at the resistance that has been exhibited, that not all Africans accepted it. So I think I think that's a wonderful way to sort of end this episode. And in our next episode, we're going to explore post-colonial development paths across the global south. Why did some of these countries surge ahead while others struggled? And how did the idea of sort of global south emerge? And what does it mean to build solidarity across continents in a world still dominated by the global north? And I'd urge you not to miss any of the episodes coming forth. And of course, we're joined here in this episode by Professor Stephen Chan. Thank you for joining us on this episode.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Sure. And for episode 1, that's me, Zenge, for Africa for Dummies as usual. Thank you for listening and see you in episode 2.
I am an African.